continue doing what we have been doing. It would be the moment, I think, if people have retrospective questions about things that we did last year to bring these up, and I would welcome such questions, observations, lists of subjects that we ought to go back and look at again. Think about that. I have a few more announcements, and if somebody does have such a thought or wants to write these kinds of questions out, I think that would also be useful, since otherwise it's a little hard for me to know what you are thinking about these things. A few practical matters. There are some more of these schedules for this year. They're not here, though, but over in the Complete office. There are also now some summaries of the first lectures that people can have that are have been very useful to me, and I think maybe for you might be helpful too, to recapitulate some of these themes that have come back. I'll be here again on February 2nd and 3rd. That is, I think, 2 weeks from today. Then after that, the end of February 23rd and 24th, and you can then pick up the rest of these dates on this schedule. There are a few modifications to be made. First of all, by an error, I have down here Wyndham Lewis's Childermass, which is indeed a very interesting book, and I wouldn't mind talking about it. But the book that we really had in mind when we first made this list up was, on the contrary, Lewis's Canadian novel, Self-Condemned. So the two official Lewis titles are Tar and Self-Condemned, rather than Tar and the Childermass. And if there should be some immense groundswell of interest and enthusiasm for Lewis, which unfortunately there never seems to be, I think not because people aren't responsive to the power of it, but because they find him somehow dislikable, which is a natural reaction, but not quite right according to me. But anyway, if there should be such a sudden discovery of enthusiasm for Lewis, who is, after all, one of the four great Anglo-American modernists, and the one who was never read and never discussed in this context, along with Pound, Joyce, and Eliot, then we could, by all means, have a look at the Childermass, which is a very, very interesting book linguistically and otherwise. It's a kind of one of the first of the theological science fiction, but not at all like the other Lewis, like C.S. Lewis, rather kind of projected imaginary world after death, in which there are a great many linguistic games that are quite different from what we know in classical modernism, Joyce, Finnegan's Wake, things like that, but no less interesting. At any rate, that's for later on in March or so. But the official title should be the Self-Condemned. Now, a few more observations. I think we'll be talking about Nostromo tomorrow and next week, maybe further. I've decided that really, if we want to use this book as it should be used and find the lessons in it that it has for us as a text and as a very complicated, interesting narrative structure, it would be well for us, along with Nostromo, to reconsider one of the really important books on narrative, something that it's always worth rereading and taking a new view of, a work which is not long but dense, but I think you'll see the connection as we work through Nostromo a little tomorrow. And this is Lukács's theory of the novel. So I would propose that we add that to the program and think about rereading Conrad in the light of theory of the novel and vice versa next week and thereafter. Now, in the kind of schizophrenic arrangement of this course, theories like that are supposed to be Thursdays and texts are supposed to be on Fridays, but I would think we would be doing practical work with Lukács and that would naturally fit into the Friday sessions rather than the Thursday ones. A final comment on the order of things here. What your schedule shows that today's topic is the critique of metaphysics, whereas we're supposed to get to Derrida next week. I'm going to reverse that because although that's a natural chronological kind of order, Marx and Nietzsche are in the 19th century and Derrida's in the 20th century, that would be what Derrida calls linear history, and we don't have to be bound to that. And I think you'll understand a little better my motives for talking about ideological analysis and the history of ideological analysis after we see what Derrida is up to and see some of the problems of evaluating what he's up to. So I think I think I would prefer to reverse this order and get to and return to this longer framework of the history of ideological analysis, the history of the critique of metaphysics, next week. Okay, any thoughts, comments, observations, questions? Well, then today we want to at least make a beginning on looking at this this work of grammatology, dermatology, and the other works of Derrida that surround it and of which it's a part. It's a kind of bewildering task, much harder in many ways than, for example, the Foucault text we looked at, since this doesn't have Derrida isn't a historian, and it doesn't have a historical framework of which one can say, as one can with Foucault, that his facts are wrong or this analysis of this period doesn't seem quite useful or seems ideological or something. What we have here, however, is also not exactly philosophy in the sense that this book makes a set of philosophical statements, or in the sense that this incorporates something that we could think of as Derrida's system, and then we could say, well, we can outline this system in the following way, and here are the basic ideas, and so on. Because precisely more than anyone else, and even more than the late Frankfurt School, I think I mentioned negative dialectics of Adorno in this context. Nonetheless, there's still a kind of systematic framework inside of Adorno, which is not really present at all here anymore, and which makes this very difficult to get hold of. Since the moment you get hold of it and you say, this here finally is what Derrida really thinks, and this is his position, you've betrayed the whole spirit of the enterprise, and you're attributing something to him which is quite inconsistent with the whole movement of this work, which, to use one of the slogans that we'll see coming back again and again as we work through this, wants to be not a philosophical statement, but let's say écriture or writing or a text or something, and that means that there is a kind of heresy of paraphrase. You can't say there's all these pages and a lot of sentences and so on, but all those signifiers, right, those material signs and sounds and sentence structures have a signified, and they mean this. That would be, for Derrida, to remain inside of the older, essentially the older views of language, which he calls metaphysical, in the sense that these older views still attribute to series of sentences and linguistic sounds and so on something separate from them, which you can replace them with, which are meanings, or meaning with a capital M. And to pursue this one theme very rapidly, it will be then taken up in a much more kind of programmatic way by the Telkel group, whom I sort of read in very close connection with Derrida, and I think much of their program comes out of Derrida. To push this through very rapidly, one can say that for Derrida and the Telquel people and others, this separation, this kind of semantics that believes that there is a signified which underlies the play of signifiers or the movement of sentences, which believes that a text like this, all these pages, have a meaning that you can finally locate, and once you've located it, you can have done with it, and you have the core of the work, that this is somehow the same as a metaphysical belief in other forms of, how can I say, sort of ontological security. That is ultimately, maybe we don't use religious codes anymore. That is, maybe Nietzsche's right, and the whole apparatus of religion is no longer alive, and so people would imagine that since they don't think about God or they don't believe in God or something, that whole religious and metaphysical temptation is not present in them and not part of their lived experience or whatever. But remember, Nietzsche was the one who said, I'm going to quote this poorly, but who said, as long as there's syntax, is this right? Anybody know the exact quote? As long as there's syntax, you might as well say that there's still God, because if you believe in meanings, then you believe in something. And whether you want to call that the deity or give it a religious coding, or if you want to just keep to the term, to semantic terms and talk about believing in meanings, the result is the same. The result is the projection of some imaginary plenitude, some kind of imaginary form of ontological security, which functions in exactly the same way as its other manifestations. So essentially, to believe in a meaning, to believe in the signified, is supposedly, from this point of view, to believe in something like God, and thus to remain in a not only a theocentric world, a logocentric world, a world that's organized around coherence, meaning, and so forth. To remain, therefore, within what he calls metaphysics, because essentially this is what is meant by metaphysics as Derrida uses the term. So, to come back to the point of this digression, it is very difficult then to pin down, and very somehow contradictory, to pin down a writer who doesn't want to say things, who doesn't want to express meanings, who doesn't want to have a system, but rather who wants to produce a text, to write écriture rather than to speak or to say something or to express something. And so, in a way, everything that I do will be contrary to the spirit and will be in some way falsifying Derrida's thought, and I think one has to do that too. But we should all be aware of the problems involved. So what we have in this work is not history. It's apparently not the kind of historical paradigm that Foucault gave us, which was, after all, a lot easier to deal with. And Foucault's linguistic difficulties were generally, seems to me, difficulties of the attempt to make a very concentrated style, ellipsis, and so forth, and to make a certain kind of style out of the things he was saying. But the overall framework of Foucault, it seems to me, is something that we can and were able to deal with very easily, insofar as it was another historical paradigm among many. The Frankfurt School, we saw, also had a historical paradigm, but there the difficulties in reading came from the fact that this historical paradigm was somehow replayed and reenacted at every moment in a kind of play of invention, production of essentially sayings or proverbs. With Derrida, on the other hand, there's also something like that perpetual present of the Frankfurt School, but there's also the same problem of a lack of perspective in the sense that this book does not have an argument that follows consecutively and which requires first this chapter and then to be completed or worked out by a whole series of steps and reaches some kind of conclusion. Rather, each one of these, in a sense, each of these chapters says the same thing over and over again on a somewhat different occasion. So that what he says, in the beginning we have some observations about textuality, which say one, the end of the book and the beginning of writing, which say one kind of thing. Then all of a sudden we have a chapter on Saussure, on Saussurean linguistics, which in a way enact the same kind of the same kind of reading over again, but about somebody different, Saussure, and then Jacobson and Husserl and so on. Then we have the Lévi-Strauss chapter on Tristopique, which does something similar, and finally Rousseau. So we have a series of commentaries which seem to be somehow how can I put it, not arbitrary exactly, but to have no necessity in their sequence or in their choice. That is, it seems clear that what we'll see Derrida showing us about what Saussure thinks of language or what Plato thinks of language or Rousseau probably could have been shown about many other people as well. Kant, Hegel, I don't know, Aristotle. And therefore, there's a kind of perpendicular work here which comes out of the commentary on a given text and doesn't link up with the other commentaries, but somehow reduplicates them and does that work over again. Not, however, in the way that the Frankfurt School repeated itself, because the Frankfurt School was really reenacting a vision of history, but rather in a kind of renewed search for an error which is common to all of these positions. Meanwhile, there's some other extraneous things too, and that complicates the book and makes it feel even more disordered than it maybe need have. On the one hand, we have several kinds of empirical materials intruding in here. There's a lot of stuff about some of this came out of a review of some scholarly works on the origins of writing itself and on the alphabet. And Derrida will talk about that, but this is not really, after all, a work about the alphabet and how it came into being, or about writing in that sense. So that those parts somehow seem both relevant and irrelevant. There are then later on in the Rousseau section, on this, most of which is consecrated to this fragmentary essay that Rousseau never published in his lifetime, the essay on the origin of language. There are also then some scholarly sections of that, which are like extended footnotes, in which Derrida argues in a kind of systematic way with certain of Rousseau's commentators, like Starobinsky and Roland Desnay, about whether the relationship of this essay to Rousseau's fundamental statement on these things, which is the discourse on the inequality of men, and whether this essay came first or afterwards, whether its ideas about language are consistent with the ideas of the essay, and so on. So that also is a kind of oddly extraneous digression in here, which is, however, completely relevant. Now, you see, I think one of the reasons why we're confused by these, by the apparent aimlessness of the subjects of these chapters is clearly that we have kept some notion of generic order, and we think that when you're going to do some scholarly footnotes and you're going to do a scholarly study on the history of a text, that's something different from philosophizing, and that should be done in a different place or a different book or in different in a different form of print or something, and so on and so forth. When one is doing commentaries on various positions and various writers, if they really are unrelated or infinitely repeatable, they should be separate essays and not part of one book, and so on. So already there's something a little bit scandalous about the way this book affirms its existence as a text. And again, I'm using this in a very special and modern way, and not in the conventional sense. It affirms its existence as text and not as a philosophical argument. That's a genre we know. Not as a coherent book, and so on and so forth. So Derrida's, in a sense, the problems of reading Derrida and of sorting all this out are relevant to what's going on. That is, all of the difficulties that we have in putting this together, or the moments when we don't see how it does fit together, are really all somehow object lessons for us in one of the fundamental things that Derrida is saying. Now, again, that's not the right way of putting it, since he's not supposed to be saying something, but you can see how this kind of self-reflexive commentary that this kind of work encourages is both catching, and I think ultimately we want to look at that and see what the value of this kind of reflexivity is, and whether it's entirely positive, because I'm not convinced that Derrida's influence has been entirely without its negative side, and some of this influence is certainly in this in the way in which a work like this constantly intimidates us about making statements, and rather encourages us to develop a kind of writing which, because it's a commentary on other statements, never makes statements of its own, and so forth. I think we're not ready to make that kind of attack or critique of Derrida yet, but I think it should be at in the perspective of what we're doing with this. Now, how can we then get a hold on this text? Maybe one of the ways of doing it would be to completely falsify the work and to turn it into a system, which in a sense it also is. See, here is the problem. Much of what Derrida is trying to say, this quest for a certain kind of error which he calls metaphysical, but which doesn't have a truth that you could substitute for it, you see. And this will be one of the basic differences between the classical critique of metaphysics the whole Enlightenment critique of metaphysics believed very strongly in the existence of something called error, but that one could destroy error, superstition, metaphysics, religion, and so on, and replace it with truth. And ultimately, in our society, this truth becomes secularized, and we call it science. Well, it's not clear that it's clear that Derrida has a notion of error, right? That is, that there is something called metaphysics, which can be described not so much as a set of thoughts, but as a set of attitudes that is then embodied in thinking and writing and so on, and all kinds of other ways. But it's not clear that there is an opposite of error. It's not clear that there's something like science. And indeed, one of the official framework of the book, it's called On Grammatology considered as a positive science. The official framework of the book, here too it's ambiguous, but suggests that maybe out of this work will come a new kind of science whose status is not clear to us. That is, this will be a science that will be called grammatology, which will be different from linguistics, which will ask different questions, have a different problematic, and maybe be a larger and vaster science than most of the meta-sciences that have been presented to us, like philosophy or dialectics or so forth, that have been presented to us until now. And then another part of the book seems to say that science is itself, the very possibility of science is itself related to writing, and therefore there could never be such a meta-science, there could never be such an organizing thing. And I think later on it's clear from Derrida's own work that this is not an attempt that's carried through. That is, that Derrida does not go on to found a school which is the school of grammatology or something, but rather that he drops this particular theme in which a lot of his thinking had been embodied or crystallized, and takes up others which seem to be much less closely related to it. Nonetheless, I think it's clear that one of the that writing is the privileged, obviously the privileged object of investigation here, and also that in a way writing becomes a kind of positive term. That is, or écriture, for which we don't have exactly the right, writing isn't, I guess, really the right word for it, but we don't have any others. Writing becomes the term for what you come to terms with, what you live in, when you're now, but now I'm importing other philosophies and other kinds of jargon, when one gets rid of the inauthenticity, let's say, of metaphysics, and is able to live in the kind of precarious authenticity of whatever the positive features of Derrida's system are. Writing is the word for that, for those positive features. To live in writing, to somehow be aware, if you like, then that everything is writing in some way that we have to describe. That would be somehow to be outside of metaphysics. That would be to abandon the metaphysical belief, among which are such illusions as the one I evoked a minute ago, namely the belief that a sentence has a meaning and so on, and rather to live in a world where sentences cannot be turned into meanings, but where if there is such a thing as meaning, it's never present at any point, and it's always in a process of generation. You can't really, and so ultimately it becomes sort of senseless to invoke this notion of meaning, and all you have left is writing. So writing becomes a kind of positive term here, or tends towards becoming a positive term. It tends, therefore, to become thematized, and so you can give it moral, you can invest it with moral value. Who knows, maybe even political and historical value, that's not clear yet, philosophical value, and so on. On the other hand, it seems to me that if you do that and you say, okay, now we've got Derrida nailed down finally. I mean, whatever else all this stuff means, he is the philosopher of écriture, and this is just as for Sartre, freedom, for Heidegger, the question of being, for, you can take it from there. So for Derrida, writing is the key central phenomenon. So, well, it's not certain that it would be right to say that. First of all, since his current work really is no longer quite so preoccupied with this particular symbol or vehicle for what he's saying, this particular manifestation writing. And for another, because even if you said that, you'd get into all kinds of problems. If you say that the simplest way of describing the position that Derrida wants to take about writing, and the position in this book, and the reason and the purpose for which he's invoking Saussure, Plato, Lévi-Strauss, and Rousseau, could be described this way, and one could take this as one possible meaning of or argument of the work. Everybody thinks that writing is a secondary feature of language, an inessential feature of language. That what comes first in all the ways that term, all the meanings that term has, what comes first historically, in the priority of daily life and so on and so forth, is speech. And if you're going to analyze language, you analyze speech, and then later on you have a chapter, as Saussure does in the course in general linguistics, you have a chapter on forms of writing, but that's not really very important. That's a kind of empirical second thought or footnote to this whole analysis of writing. And all of these thinkers do this, and we'll see a little later on, or maybe we should see right now how it's done, because there's some very interesting, they betray themselves in very interesting ways, and the fact that that these are unguarded references to writing in all these thinkers is of particular use to Derrida. That is, it's as though one of the other things that this is a kind of it's a quest for error. It's a kind of psychoanalysis of certain metaphysical errors. And of course, in any kind of analysis, it's very often the secondary kinds of things, the things people say without really thinking about it, apparently inessential symptoms and so on, that are the most valuable for the analysis. The central statements that people make, their resistance is at work, and those things are hard to crack. But you find a way into something through these secondary features. Well, until Derrida, no one had warned us over 2,000 or 3,000 years of Western culture that we had to be very careful when we said anything about writing, because our attitudes towards writing would supply some very useful and crucial clues to our whole metaphysic and so forth. Rather, the philosophers paid attention to what they said about being or about the divinity and so forth. But the observations on writing, and this is true of all of these works, are almost all secondary and come later on and don't seem to be the most important things any of these people said. Well, this is why it's so handy to use this as a thematic, how can you say it, as a heuristic device, that is, as a thing that you track down. So there is a certain Derridianism, kind of mechanical, vulgar Derridianism, I would say, insofar as this is a method, which can be reduced to this methodological canon. Watch for what people say about writing. Go through a work, and so you seize on, you're reading a novel. I haven't really done that for Conrad, but Said has in Beginnings. And other people have done this for other writers. You track down in this text the slightest sort of mentions of something which is writing or like writing, and these will become infinitely precious symptoms for unlocking the work as a whole. I think that's probably not... that has had some interesting results, certainly in Derrida, but like any method, if it's mechanical, it can be, it ends up not being very productive. At any rate, this is what he shows. I'll give the references here to the English of Derrida, but if people want the French references, I've laboriously tried to collate these things so I can give you the French pages too. Here's something that Saussure says about writing. Let's see. Whoever says that, I'm quoting Saussure now, but the spoken word is so intimately, page 36, so intimately bound to its written image, so Saussure thinks that writing is an image of spoken language, that the latter manages to usurp the main role. Well, now Derrida, what Derrida is going to zero in on is the moral evaluation and the negative connotations, the judgment involved in the word usurp. That is, as we'll see later when I generalize this in a very different way, what we have is a binary opposition coming into being, speech and writing, and at once this binary opposition becomes moralized and moralizing, and becomes the vehicle, therefore, for what are essentially not only moral, but in a way kind of legal judgments of good and evil. There's something good, there's a positive term and a negative term. And the positive term has to be speech, and then the negative term is writing, and that usurps the role of speech. So usurping is already to open up the whole area of the artificial, the unnatural, the wrong, the harmful, and so on and so on and so on. And one has a whole a whole dimension of the negative in its ethical form, which is somehow which comes out of Saussure here without its being at all the most important thing he has to say in this section on writing. It's a kind of slip of the tongue or kind of offhand thing. He's caught in some kind of patterning system here without even wanting to be. And this patterning system is an ethical system which obliges him, whether he likes it or not, to suddenly to create a good term and a bad term, and thus to reinvent a kind of dialectic or a non-dialectic, really, an opposition, which is an ethical opposition. Okay, some more examples of this, but there are lots of them. Whoever says that a certain letter must be pronounced in a certain way is mistaking the written image of a sound for the sound itself. One attributes the oddity, bizarrerie, to an exceptional pronunciation, and Derrida comments on this. What is intolerable and fascinating is indeed the intimacy intertwining image and thing, graph, that is, and phone, to the point where by a mirroring, inverting, and perverting effect, speech seems in its turn the speculum of writing, which manages to usurp the main role. Some other quotes from Saussure. The result is that people forget that they learn to speak before they learn to write, and the natural sequence is reversed. Now we've got what we had for our negative term. We have already a whole set of characteristics: usurping, artificial, unnatural, perversion, and so on and so forth. Now the positive term comes into being. Obviously, the positive term then is going to be what's natural, what's right, what's in the order of things, what's original, and so on and so forth. And all of this coming out of really not a primary statement, but just a kind of set of secondary reflexes in Saussure's discussion of something else. Obviously, Saussure is not setting out to create an ethics of language or really to attack written speech at all, but this is what happens because of some mechanism that it remains for us to determine, or for Derrida to determine. Okay, usurpation, and so on. The literary language adds to the undeserved importance of writing. Thus, writing assumes undeserved importance, une importance à laquelle elle n'a pas droit, and so on and so forth. Okay, now, would it be useful? Okay, to substitute immediately what is natural for what is artificial, page 38, would be necessary, but this is impossible without first studying the sounds of what is language. Detached from their graphic signs, sounds represent only vague notions, and the prop provided by writing, though deceptive, is still preferable. The first linguists, who knew nothing about the physiology of articulated sounds, were constantly falling into a trap. You see, writing is constantly, on all of these levels, having this kind of global negative effect, either error, all the way from error to the unnatural and perversion. The first linguists who knew nothing about that were constantly falling into a trap. To let go of the letter was for them to lose their foothold. To me, it means a first step in the direction of truth, but obviously then a truth which you'll reach only after you get rid of writing and you get rid of this error and so on. Well, much of the Saussure section of this book is a kind of, I won't call it a sottisier, but a kind of collection of these reflexes or tics or something in Saussure's own thinking, which is produced by this peculiar mechanism of good and bad speech versus writing. Now, the other great example, of course, is Plato, and this is less developed in the grammatology, although he does quote one of the sections that he likes the best, which is in the Phaedrus, isn't that the myth of the Thoth in Phaedrus, the creation of writing and so forth. But this is developed then at much greater length in another essay of Derrida, and I don't know whether this is in English or not, called La pharmacologie de Platon. It's in La Dissémination, which in many ways is, for me, Derrida's most interesting book or collection of essays. It has to do with Plato, Mallarmé, and a novel and a text of Solaire. So it's also Derrida on a literary text. And it has some very interesting observations about his own method and so forth, if you have the curiosity to look at that. At any rate, one can clearly do for Plato. For Derrida, the Platonic hostility to representation is only a later and more, to mimesis and so on, to theater, to the artists and so forth, is only a much later and more complex stage of this initial belief that Plato has that the writing is evil. Socrates didn't write, he spoke, he dialogued. Plato squares the circle, but nonetheless what he writes down is supposed to be spoken dialogue and not writing in that sense, and so forth. Now, is it worth reading a few examples of this? Let's see. Yes, here's Socrates talking about, this is Derrida's summary a little bit. Self-proclaimed language, auto-production of a speech declared alive. This is what living speech is. Capable, Socrates said, of helping itself, a logos which believes itself to be its own father, being lifted thus above written discourse, speechless and infirm at not being able to respond when one questions it, and since its parent's help is always needed. This must therefore be born writing out of a primary gap and a primary expatriation, condemning it to wandering and blindness, to mourning. This is the Platonic theory. This is Plato's repudiation of writing. Writing is a child that you send out into the world without its parent. You write down, you are the parent of this written text. You produce it, and then you send it out, and then the child can't answer anymore. You have here's this child, but it's a speechless child, and you want to ask it questions, and Socrates wants to then put it to the test and ask all the great Socratic questions of it, and he can't because it doesn't answer. And therefore, in that sense, writing is secondary for Plato, and always secondary to speech, which is central because as it's produced, you can always go back to the source of speech, ask more questions, and the speech, living speech, can then explain itself and so forth. Well, at that point, you observe, when we track this particular prejudice, this will later get a name, and we call it the logocentric prejudice, since it believes that speaking, the logos, is the center of everything, and writing is eccentric, and when you valorize speech, automatically you're devalorizing writing and so on. As we track this logocentric prejudice in Plato, what we find emerging is now a new level of things, which is a psychoanalytic level, fathers and children, sexuality and so on. And that will then become part of Derrida's method too in a very interesting and kind of idiosyncratic way. Well, then there's Lévi-Strauss, and Lévi-Strauss projects this onto a wholly new plane, this whole logocentric thing. And Derrida is not, this isn't a critique of these people exactly. I mean, one has to understand that he has done critiques which are obviously hostile, although guarded in the way that he does these commentaries. I would say the thing on Searle in what's it called? Glyph, in the New Hopkins magazine. Equally obviously, the attack on Lacan, the facteur de la vérité, the postman of truth, the purveyor of truth, they call it. That's translated in one of the Yale French studies of an issue or two ago. Those are outright hostile demolitions, but most of these things are done with great complicity for the positions involved. That it's not clear at all that Derrida is repudiating these positions, but rather that he's adopting them and criticizing himself from within them in a way, and that these things ultimately are some kind of autocritique or self-criticism. This is certainly the case when you get to Lévi-Strauss, where the basic logocentric prejudice will now be expanded. It's no longer only a moral prejudice, that is one which says good, bad, logos is good, writing is wicked, perversion, unnatural, and so on. But now, from the individual level in Lévi-Strauss, it's generalized onto the level of society. And now we have this very, Derrida picks, of course, the key, crucial, central chapter of Triste Tropique in which Lévi-Strauss discusses the relationship of writing to social power, and in which he enunciates this scandalous but very interesting thesis that writing and power are at one, and that the invention of writing is at one with the coming into being of the state, that is, a political society, of societies based on domination. This is all a kind of fable that Lévi-Strauss gets from his experience with the Nabucco or the Barora, I don't know which, in which the anecdote is this, that the chief, he's observed Lévi-Strauss making his notes, and on the various conversations and so on that he's had with these native informants, and at one point, towards the end of his stay, he observes that the chief, and in the earliest tribal societies, you understand that the chief is not yet a center of political power, but rather he's the person who talks. There's another interesting book by Pierre Clastre, who recently died, called, it's several books on the Guayaqui Indians in Bolivia, where he shows that the whole point of a really primitive social organization is to avoid the concentration of political power, rather than to create it. So in those societies, unlike the later political societies where the chief is the center and the very figurehead of power, which then revolves around him, the chief or the headman or the big man, or whatever the word for this is, in a really primitive society, is there only to speak and not to make decisions. Nobody pays any attention to him, but his function is precisely he calls an assembly, and then he talks at these people. They laugh at him, and then they do what they want. But he has no. So in a sense, he's there as a kind of lightning rod to prevent the crystallization of power, rather than to serve as that around which power crystallizes itself. Obviously, then the whole question here is the question of the origin of history, the origin of the state, of power, and so forth. And this is the fundamental question in Rousseau. And it's the question around which Lévi-Strauss' fable turns, because what Lévi-Strauss finds is that the chief, who before this is of this earlier type, the chief is busy scrawling things on pieces of paper and making things which look like shapes and drawings and lines, which look like writing. From this, Lévi-Strauss concludes that the possession of this writing will be, for this chief, the vehicle for the conquest of real power, of state power. And thus, this moment in which the chief imitates Lévi-Strauss' writing, in which, therefore, the chief himself shows himself now to have, like the foreigner, a monopoly on the word and on writing, a monopoly on writing rather than only, as before, monopoly on interpretation and speaking, that this is a key moment in this accumulation process which will produce power and the state. So in Lévi-Strauss, in some almost delirious way, when you begin with the Saussurean or Platonic kinds of prejudices, suddenly this prejudice against writing is projected out into history itself, and writing becomes synonymous with power and with domination and with repression and so forth, and not merely with the various kinds of moral flaws and so forth that we saw in the earlier in these earlier thinkers. Finally, then, we come to Rousseau himself, and I will then postpone that for a little bit because I want to say some other things about the earlier part of the book. But in Rousseau, it's clear then that there is a profound suspicion of. Rousseau is even more interesting than any of these other people because in Rousseau, the suspicion of writing begins to attach itself to the logos, to ordinary speaking. For Rousseau, it would certainly be better if we spoke without writing, as for Plato, as for Saussure, and so on, as for Lévi-Strauss. But it would be even better if we didn't speak at all, and if this whole unnatural, artificial, evil instrument of domination and so on, and the Rousseau word for this will be, and this is then the key word of the grammatology, supplement, because it's not part of the original thing itself, human life, but added on to it, and anything that's added on is supplementary, is artificial, and therefore is somehow evil or morally wrong or whatever. For Rousseau, it would be desirable to get rid of the whole thing, and of course, then what in Rousseau is so useful as far as Derrida is concerned is that this very movement in Rousseau's thought, which says it's not only writing that's bad, it's speaking that's bad, this really confirms Derrida's position, which is that it's not that speech precedes writing, but writing precedes speech. Writing is not some later thing that that attaches to some kind of speeches, some types of speech, and not others. Writing is the very structure of all speech. It's the logos that's secondary. It's talking that's secondary. It's writing that's somehow primary. And Rousseau, by the kind of movement of his kind of almost instinctive movement of his own thought and his own suspicions, repudiating not only writing but speaking itself, has somehow shown more clearly and more dramatically than anybody else, according to Derrida, or allows us to see more clearly than in most other texts of this kind, that there is in all speaking, even before the invention of the alphabet, before the invention of any kind of written signs, something which one has to call writing, and which therefore Derrida will call, because I don't know how Gayatri translates this, archi-écriture, because this is then how can I say, the inner truth of all writing. Is there anybody know what this is, how this is archi writing? Oh, that can't be it. Do you know what the translation of it is in the English text? I don't want to keep saying archi-couture. Well, I'll find it at some point. Okay, but if that's the case then, if all speaking is really writing, it's not just writing which has the structure that interests us, but all speaking secretly has this structure, whether it knows it or not, whether it thinks it or not, then we need these two terms. We need a term, écriture, meaning writing in its literal sense, and then we need a figural or figurative term, archi-écriture, hyper-writing or whatever, which will be the structure of all writing, even when when we don't have to do with official writing. Well, but now to come back to my starting point again, I'm sorry for these kinds of digressions, but it seems unavoidable in dealing with a book like this. That means that writing is not really the basic theme of Derrida's thinking here, but rather because that means then that official writing, script and so on, is only a pretext. And what he's really interested in is that for which script, in its most banal sense, is itself a figure, archi-écriture. But at that point then, we've taken this one theme and we've sort of emptied it of its content. And then it's clear that if writing is a useful, well, in the literary world, I guess we tend to say, if writing is your privileged metaphor, I think that's probably a poor way of saying this, but we tend to use these terms, so why not? If writing is Derrida's principal metaphor, it is still only that, a metaphor. And then we ought to be able to have other kinds of themes or other kinds of metaphors in which or through which we could say the same thing. Now, as I say, this is a kind of ambiguity or ambivalence in Derrida's work. On the one hand, he is the philosopher of writing, and there is basically writing is somehow his ultimate, how can I put it, his ultimate signified, the very cornerstone of his system. He's talking about texts, he's investing the very notion of either writing or architecture with this ultimate moral content and so forth. And he really can't be separated from that, and his work is somehow tied absolutely to the whole problem of writing. But on the other hand, and it's in this sense, I think, that he has been taken by many of his English commentators, and because with Derrida we have a problem that we didn't have so much for Foucault or for the Frankfurt School, namely that there is a French situation of Derrida's work, and then there is well, British too, but mainly North American situation, which has invented a Derridianism of which Derrida is maybe not himself the best example or even the prototype, and so I think we have there yet another problem, not only trying to figure out what Derrida himself is saying here, but finding out what this has turned into as it's been used and been applied in quite different situations and in quite different disciplines. At any rate, he has certainly, for a long time in English, been understood to be the philosopher of writing in that narrow sense, whereas his own work has tended, it seems to me, to evolve away from that, and not to speak a great deal anymore, it seems to me, of writing as such, but to have somehow broadened this whole set of themes and refracted them into different kinds of metaphors or different kinds of terms, and thus in a way to leave this behind. But in that case, it's clear why grammatology could never have been a science, right? Because if it's only a metaphor, and if there are other ways of tracking these things down, and other fundamental themes and other privileged metaphors, then this really only was a metaphor, and we're back in some purely conceptual world, and we're not necessarily bound to writing as the ultimate and privileged theme or type of raw material. Okay, what are some of the other forms that this has taken? What Derrida is very good at is the invention of new terms or themes, and the sort of instinctive sense of how one parleys a particular problem into a kind of thematic crystallization. It's a thematic crystallization which is not, I think, which is no longer, which is not like the older invention of philosophical terms. I think it's much closer to what I was showing about Foucault, although on a very different level, when we talked about the material interpretant, and I would relate it to something that will come back later on in this course, namely the tendency of intellectual life in consumer society to produce, and like capitalism generally, to produce private languages and to destroy the older universal codes and universal signifiers, and to replace these with local codes which are somehow, which have a kind of built-in obsolescence. That is, if you're in the world of private languages, it's like buying a new refrigerator. You're supposed to get rid of it in a few years. In the older kind of capitalism, you're supposed to hang on to it for life. You know, when you bought furniture, that was passed on down to your great-grandchildren and so on. Well, today we know that after 5 years, we're all agreed that to make things function, you get rid of these things and you substitute something else. So there's a whole logic of late capitalism, which is this replaceableness of the object world and this kind of planned obsolescence of these commodities. The same seems to be happening in the intellectual world for reasons which are not only those of the economy, but also those of the very way that value is organized in our societies. That is, you have a universal code when you have social cohesion. when a society's inner logic is towards a kind of parcelization, atomization, towards the creation of ever smaller groups, which sort of coexist within the apparently older. So you have the older city, which was still a kind of community. Well, today we still live in cities, but we all live in kind of almost primitive tribes within the cities that coexist. I mean, we have our own sort of paths, social paths. There are kinds of villages that come into being within the archaic framework of the older city, and which are the result, it seems to me, of precisely this process of social atomization, where the older community doesn't exist, and therefore its codes and its values and its religion or its privileged terms, its philosophy, its ideology, that can't exist anymore either, and therefore everyone has to invent sort of local versions or reinvent local versions of these things. We see this in our works of art in the way that each of the great modern writers has invented a set of symbols and a kind of style. That, it seems to me, was the initial step in this process of the creation of private languages. And now we see it, I think, much more clearly and openly in the world of philosophical statements, where all of these things build on something else. Derrida does not have a system of his own, because systems are part of the older world of meanings and codes and so on. What you do now is something local. You take a text and you make a commentary on it, and you say what you want to say through that, but then that's sort of self-destructible or obsolescent too, because you can get rid of that, you make another commentary and so on. You're not bound once and for all to the Hauptwerk of the older systematic philosophy. Well, one of the features of this production of private languages we observed at work, it seems to me, in that Foucault book, in the way in which you take something like the panopticon and organize your text around it such that it becomes something like a symbol, but again, not really a symbol because it's only a pretext, but yet you couldn't say what you wanted to say without it. I think we surprised there one of the structures of this process of the production of private languages. With Derrida, we see a different one of these, that is the invention of what is not jargon but sort of pseudo-jargon or pseudo-philosophical terms. Terms which you can't, which are still imaged, which still have a metaphorical content, if that's the right way to say it, which still are somehow figural attached to figuration in their very nature, so they can't be made to be completely abstract, the way the older philosophical ideas were. That is, if you want to invent a philosophical concept, you make it completely abstract. You remove the traces of figural content within it, and then it can serve as a real abstract term. Well, these terms can't be used that way. Écriture, for example. You push it towards a certain kind of abstraction, but there's always this figural content in it that drags it back and makes it, therefore, partly an image, partly a thought, and confirms its existence as a private language. But there are plenty of other ones. Now, Gayatri Spivak, in her introduction, lists a few. And Derrida himself lists some in various places. But here we are. The movement of, well, here are some of the nicknames for this thing for which so far we only know one word, namely écriture, or writing. But here's some more words for it, and now you can see that it has nothing to do with writing. Trace. Different, trace already, well, that still has to do with making marks, and so that could still be writing. Difference, but spelled with an A rather than an E, meaning, therefore, in Derrida's invention of this term, that it's both a process of deferring in time and of a play of differences. So this is a temporal word, difference, as well as a logical word. Reserve. Supplement, and this will be a very key word, and this is not Derrida's word, but Rousseau's word. And in this sense, Derrida is to Rousseau a little bit like, we'll see how this works out in a bit, but, or Rousseau is to Derrida as Freud is to Lacan, or Marx is to Althusser. That is a kind of central text in which something is worked out, which, however, you have to correct a little bit because it's not quite, it doesn't quite function the way it's supposed to. Dissemination, this is his word for polysemousness or multiple meanings, but he means it to have, and this is riddled, as you know, with all kinds of sexual, with a sexual dimension. It's not Freudian in the sense that he privileges the things that Freud privileges, but rather among the various levels of meaning in a term like dissemination is also the sexual one. He gets this from Freud's magic notebook essay and other. That is, he means this to be the notion of supplement in Rousseau, as we'll see, is among other things connected with masturbation. Therefore, with what Marx supplements as being morally wrong, artificial, unnatural, and so on. So also dissemination means not multiple meanings that you could admire and use in some architectonic way, but rather waste, lots of stuff, like a kind of mental onanism, meanings that fall to the ground, as again in masturbation, or meanings that kind of a random production of all kinds of things. And he, I think, part of the politics and part of the ethics of Derrida are very closely attached to this defense of something which is not too different from the kind of 60s Norman O'Brien type polymorphous perversity, and which has that kind of countercultural ring, if one can recognize it. Well, here's some more, maybe more offensive. Hymen, I'm not sure quite how that fits. Greffe, pharmakon, which is the key word of the Plato essay, and designates both the poison and the counterpoison, and is also related to the notion of the scapegoat, which is the same term in Greek. And so on approaches, once again, this political projection that we saw in Lévi-Strauss, where part of this process of banning a negative term, of setting up an opposition such that it's good and bad, and the good is what's natural in order to separate people into the ones that belong in the city and the ones that don't, and so on and so forth. So this is in Derrida a project of the analysis and the tracking down of metaphysics and error, a process which ultimately has its political dimension. And I think whatever one thinks of that political dimension, I want to insist a little bit later on the idea, and this is certainly Derrida's feeling, that this work is a form of political praxis, and that there is a political level involved in what we now sort of generally call deconstruction. But it's a political practice, again, that I think is very difficult to detect in the transplantation situation of Derrida in English and in the university system. And so I think it may be worth underscoring that even more than I've just done, and showing how this is, as far as he's concerned, not merely a philosophical project to criticize metaphysics, to show the metaphysical limits in which our thinking is caught, but also a form of the denunciation of power and the attack on domination and the attack on all of the forms which domination takes. Now, it is a formal, as we'll see, it's a formal politics. It's as though, and this isn't yet a criticism on my part, but just a way of trying to pin it down a little more. It's as though whatever the content of your thinking was, obviously there can be an outright political content, right? That is, people can can be reactionary or sexist or racist or whatever, and this is the content of their thinking, and one can criticize all this on that level. Well, it's as though that, for Derrida, was something which is done or being done somewhere and so on, and is not what he's up to here. Rather, it's as though alongside of that political and repressive content of thinking, there is also a form of thinking which can be repressive no matter what its content is. And I want to suggest that there is a way of reading Derrida which is not commonly practiced here, in which we could set, in terms of which Derrida would look very different from the way he's traditionally been presented to us, in which we could say it's not exactly the whole notion of écriture that he's after. This is not really, these are not the main, deconstruction is not really involved with that. Rather, the whole point of deconstruction is to track down the repressive, ethical and then political operations and effects of binary oppositions, of thinking in terms of oppositions, one of which is privileged and one of which is always unprivileged under anti-privilege. And I think we could rewrite Derrida as a kind of political and formal methodology, which sought those, which was intent on tracking these mechanisms, these repressive mechanisms, in any particular text that he found, and then that seems to be very much given over to chance what texts he works with. And as you may know also, his marginality is reaffirmed by the fact that he's not in the educational system in France. That is, he's not in the university. He's never wanted to have a doctorat or to defend to offer any of these things as the thesis which it would be necessary to do if you were to make your career within the university system. And his work at the École Normale is therefore a kind of very marginal and non-authenticated kind of work. And so he feels, I think, that by choice and in the structure of things, it's rather people like Foucault who are somehow the establishment and in the power centers of the French university system, where his position is somehow deliberately marginalized in all the good senses of all these terms. That is, his teaching is thus a dissemination in these sort of marginal places that he has to do with, and not an enseignement of the type that would come from a center of power and from a locus of power, meaning, and so on and so forth. Okay, we'll come back to this question in a little later, perhaps, when we work through some of these other sections, or the Rousseau sections. I think. Well, let's go back then to this question of terms and private languages. So we see that although on the one hand you can say, if you said that Derrida's main thrust was against logocentrism and used the whole theme or metaphor of écriture as its organizing thread, it wouldn't be wrong. But I think you've been able to see, as I use these other terms, the trace, différence or difference, and so forth, that really the implications of this are much broader. Now, we could translate those back into other kinds of languages. I mean, I think one thing one way of saying what these terms imply in Derrida would be a Hegelian one, in spite of what he sometimes says about Hegel and sometimes doesn't say. You could say, well, what is this? What is all this aim at attacking? Because then the bad term for these things is presence. All of these terms, différence, trace, supplement, écriture, are terms which, to live with which would mean living without the illusion of absolute presence. Now, I used some other words for that a while back, the signified, God, meaning, and so on. Well, but ultimately, the metaphysical term, the key metaphysical term for Derrida is presence of any type. The belief that there is a plenitude of being. The belief that at some point you have full meaning or full presence or utopia or whatever you like. Now, in one way, if you were coming at this from a Hegelian tradition, you could say, well, we recognize this. I mean, this is nothing new. This is the critique, the Hegelian critique of immediacy. What is presence but immediacy? And all of Hegel is aimed at springing the mind out of the illusion that immediacy is anything. That when you're immediately present to, immediacy is presence after all, when you're immediately present to the world, things, this present moment of time, you think that's the most concrete thing there is. Everything else is abstract. Thoughts are abstract. Well, that's the beginning of the phenomenology of spirit, and the whole movement of the book tries to show us that may look like the most concrete form of presence, but it's the emptiest and most meaningless thing of all, and that really everything, we get to everything real and essential only through mediation, that is, moving away from immediacy, from a critique of immediacy. Well, you could really, I think, enlist in many ways Derrida in that project, although it's a very funny kind of, a very odd kind of juxtaposition, since in Derrida it doesn't go anywhere. In Hegel it moves towards something which is absolute spirit, but in Derrida it must never go anywhere. It must only get out of immediacy. It must only practice mediations, but not mediations towards anything, apparently. That would be one older philosophical language in terms of which we could rephrase what's going on here. Now, obviously, I'm using the ones that mean something to me, and maybe you have other ones that it would be desirable for you to rewrite this in terms of. Another one, and this is very odd too, would be the Sartrean one. All of these, Sartre is never mentioned in contemporary post-structural philosophy, or only very negatively and condescendingly, and part of this is obviously due to the kind of immense pressure of Sartre on all these people, this sort of vast body of work on everything out of which everything has come, and even structuralism and post-structuralism, makes it sort of hard for newer philosophies and newer things to come into being, and there are also philosophical differences with Sartre that many of these people have, but some of this is a kind of Oedipal, an Oedipal forgetting or repudiation. But I think Sartre could be enlisted as one description, classical Sartrean existentialism is one description of what's going on in this term écriture, because after all, being in nothingness taught us that to believe that the human, that the experience of consciousness, that the experience of lived experience, existence, whatever you want to call it, that existence as we live it in daily life and in all situations has a kind of built-in optical illusion. That the experience of being for itself, the pour soi, the for itself, that's consciousness in Sartre, somehow doesn't seem to be able to get along without imagining that ultimately someplace at the end of time or in the next moment or something, we'll stop being just being for ourselves, we'll stop being just consciousness, and we'll become real being. And they'll come into being what Sartre calls the en soi pour soi. Being which is for itself and in itself. Consciousness which also has the density and solidity of being. And much of Sartre's early work is designed to track down this optical illusion and to show how and to make essentially a moral denunciation of this apparent obsession of consciousness with abolishing itself, this kind of mirage of the possibility of the coming into being of this full and dense kind of plenitude of being, which is never there. Well, and which for Sartre is ultimately God and metaphysical and so on and so forth. Well, I think if one sees Derridian presence as another form of the Sartrean en soi pour soi, then of precisely this mirage of some ultimate plenitude of being, which is in the very fabric of all of our experiences, right? Because we're living in time, and that's intolerable, and so we think at every moment we're going to get to the end of time. We're reading a book. Well, but that's intolerable just to read one thing after. We have to read to come to the end of a book, because then that perspective of the end of the book is something has been completed, and when we get to that point, there'll be some sort of plenitude of being. We'll cease to be living in time in this kind of intolerably vacillating way, and we'll have achieved some kind of plenitude. But of course it doesn't happen. We're still in time when we get through the end of the book. Or you're thirsty, you drink a glass of water. The very nature of thirst suggests that there'll be a kind of moment of plenitude when we'll still be thirsty and not thirsty all at once. And that will be the en soi pour soi. But what happens is you just stop being thirsty. And you don't have a plenitude of being, you're back in time again. So for Sartrean moral philosophy, the whole point of this discovery that everything in human life was operated under this kind of tug of this mirage of absolute being, the whole thrust of Sartrean moral philosophy then is to try to encourage people to live authentically, that is to live in time, to live without this illusion of ultimate plenitude, or to live, then Camus' formula, to live in a way like Sisyphus, and in a temporal world which has no end and which has no fulfillment, and so on and so forth. It seems to me that there is one way. It seems to me inescapable that one way that one can and must read Derrida's notion of écriture, when you give it a kind of ethical sense, is in those terms. And that écriture is this kind of Sartrean authenticity, and believing in meaning is the opposite, is then logocentrism and all of its various forms, and the belief in presence, the mirage of presence, is at one with Sartre's notion of the mirage of absolute being, the plenitude of being. Now, I don't know what Derrida would think of that, but that I think at least has the usefulness of placing Derrida in a somewhat longer tradition, and thus giving us maybe another handle on his work, and also underscoring something which is also never so clear when we remain locked in the whole vocabulary and language of writing per se and language per se, namely to show that this is also partly an ethical project. That is, this is also in some funny kind of way ethical philosophy or anti-ethical philosophy, and we can't really sense the whole vibrations and resonance of it until we understand it as such. Now, why is it wrong then to say, well, Derrida is just a Hegelian or a Sartrean or something? Well, it's wrong not for reasons of this community of meaning or of attitude or sort of moral thrust or something, but more, I think, because of the questions of philosophical terms. Sartre believed in philosophical vocabulary and philosophical systems, and he thought you could invent terms and they could mean something once and for all, and it would be sort of hard. You need a very elaborate 600 or 700 page framework, and you need work in the philosophical tradition itself in order to somehow hammer those terms into something meaningful. But ultimately, one can do that. One can write it out and have a system, and then people can read it and know what you mean, and so on and so forth. So Sartre is still in the world of systems and still in the world of ultimate meanings and words that can be made to mean something once and for all, just like Humpty Dumpty wanted them to. Now, for Derrida, it's clear that can't be done. And so so he's obliged, so he can never make his versions of this into terms that are permanent like that. These terms must always substitute for each other. And when you get rid of them, you throw them out, and you have some new ones. And there, as I say, one of the great, and this is part of, I think, the peculiar strength of Derrida's sensibility is this this marvelous gift he has for precisely inflecting a word or an image in the direction of a term and making it a momentary philosophical term, making it for a time a philosophical term, a vehicle for some philosophical meaning, which it'll then lose as it's replaced by something else. And hence this steady stream of these things, which is not stopping, and of which he's inventing new ones, and so on. Is that the only way one can proceed? Well, via Heidegger, he found another way of doing this, which I think is in many ways more interesting for us. I mentioned it already in another one of these talks. But it's sort of basic here, and I think raises even more interesting problems than those private languages which we've seen Derrida inventing. Incidentally, it seems to me that what's the matter with the private languages are not so much his positive terms, écriture, dissémination, and so forth, but rather the term he's repudiating, which doesn't change. And it seems to me that what one can really object to is not what he's standing for and what these various terms reaffirm for us, but rather what he's attacking, because that seems to be much more persistent and permanent. And then one could begin to wonder, is it so that that really there has always been a nostalgia of presence? And is it really right to turn this word presence or logocentrism or something into the feature that characterizes all the forms of this metaphysical error from the beginning of at least class history? This would lead us then to the whole question of Derrida's historical framework. I suggested that in the beginning that this wasn't a history. This is done in commentary form. It seems to have no historical, but it has a buried history, of course, too. And there is a historical narrative in this, and there is a historical paradigm. And we'll have to come back to that. And this is, I think, another point at which Derrida is vulnerable and open to some form of criticism, whether his own or some other kind. So we'll come back in a while to what's implied for a historical paradigm by this notion of metaphysics, of presence, of all of the things which the other terms are there to denounce, écriture, dissémination, and so forth. Before we do that, we want to look at this other way of dealing with a language which is caught and locked into all these errors. What do you do with this since you can't invent a new language? Well, maybe you can. Now, there are these moments, and they are probably historically conditioned. De la Grammatologie is 67, if I'm not mistaken. What we say, Foucault, Les mots et les choses is 66, 67. There is a certain emergent post-structuralism pre-May 68, which is still relatively prophetic. Or utopian in some very special sense. That is, we saw this very clearly in Foucault, who seemed to be saying the old way of things is passing and a whole new world is coming into being. We don't quite know what it is yet, but God is dead, man is dead, and now we're in some new linguistic universe, and there's a whole there's a whole new language and way of and constellation of values and so on. Of which we can make ourselves in a kind of Nietzschean way the forerunners, and thus we're at the dawn of something which is the end of our present closure or paradigm or whatever. Well, there are things like that in Derrida too, and that's very clear in the Grammatologie. That is, it's clear that there are certain instances where Derrida is tempted. Let's see if there's nothing quite as dramatic as the Foucault end of man passage, but nonetheless, there are a few things. Let me see if I can find something here. The very project, again, of the Grammatology, that's a kind of very, if you like, fairly timid or very much more, how can I put it, much more academic way of expressing prophecy than this kind of open Nietzschean Vatic kind of language of Foucault. But nonetheless, that suggests, our older sciences are now gone. We got to think about everything in a new way. Grammatology suggests the nascent possibilities of precisely thinking in a new way. But here's another passage, page 61. Let's see. It is to escape falling back into this naive objectivism that this is the various structural linguists, that I refer here to a transcendentality that I elsewhere put into question. It's because I believe that there is a short of and a beyond of transcendental criticism, an en deçà and an au-delà. It's not a very felicitous translation. To see to it that the beyond does not return to the within is to recognize in the contortion the necessity of a pathway. That is to say, if you're thinking about the end of a period, you think about the end of a closure that you're caught in. We're caught in the closure of metaphysics, right? That's one of the basic features of this argument. We can't not think in these terms of presence and logocentrism. We're locked into this. But if we know we're locked into it, aren't we already partly out of it too? Well, there's an au-delà of this kind of thinking, which would say, let's forget about this closure of metaphysics. Let's at once live in this new world that we see dawning. But Derrida is reluctant to take that leap and remains within this closure, but just anticipating. And that's this en deçà, or this, what Gayatri translates as this short of anticipation of a utopian transformation of thought, but then after thought of everything else. That pathway must leave a track in the text. Without that track, abandoned to the simple content of its conclusions, the ultra-transcendental text will so closely resemble the pre-critical text as to be indistinguishable from it. You have to see what he's telling us here. He's saying, look, I know that you're impatient and annoyed with this commentary form. Here, I'm picking all of these examples of older metaphysical thinking. I'm staying inside of them. I'm doing an inner, what do you call it, an analysis from within on their own terms. I'm implying that there's something beyond them, but I'm never taking that jump. And why am I doing that? Well, because there is a danger in statements. All statements get sucked back into the metaphysics of meanings. So if I were to take an absolute position and say, not this, but that, it would look as though I were doing something much more revolutionary than I am. I would be doing something much more prophetic. And yet I would be susceptible to this kind of metaphysical, to the temptations and the traps of metaphysics, much more than I am in this very complicated, involuted, internal way of suggesting a statement that I don't dare make. So to make a transcendental statement, utopian, anticipating the future in a utopian way, trying to say, what would it be like not to have metaphysics? What would it be like? You tell us, Derrida, about, you show us the operations of the metaphysical limits on people's thinking and so on over 3,000 years. Well then, give us an idea of what it would be like to be outside of that, to be doing something radically different and living in some radically different way. Well, but if now he mapped it out for us, the text that resulted would be a set of statements and would be back in metaphysics. And so this is somehow the double bind that his whole operation is caught in. We must now form and meditate upon the law of this resemblance, as why it is that the ultra-transcendental text will so closely resemble the pre-critical text and be indistinguishable. What I call the erasure of concepts, this is what I'm going to come back to, ought to mark the places of that future meditation. For example, the value of the transcendental archi must make its necessity felt before letting itself be erased. The concept of the here's the architrace. I don't know how you pronounce this in English. The architrace must comply with both that necessity and that erasure. It is in fact contradictory and not acceptable within the logic of identity. The trace is not only the disappearance of origin within the discourse that we sustain and according to the path that we follow, it means that the origin did not even disappear, that it was never constituted, except reciprocally by non-origin, and so forth. Okay, now, in other words, what he's saying is that we're locked into these older terms whether we like it or not. If we're aware of being locked into them, this is an anticipatory thing, but it can never be really turned into positive statements, but has to be lived immanently, that's the word I was looking for, and not transcendentally, in other words. But we have another kind of technique we can use, that's what I'll close with, and this is something that Heidegger invented. It's a curious exchange between Heidegger and Ernst Jünger in the 50s about being and nihilism and so on. And at one point Heidegger said, well, look, we have to use these words like being, nothingness, and so on, but they suggest things that we don't want them to suggest. We don't want people to think that they're names for something. How are we going to convey this? But we can't not use them. How are we going to do these two things at once? How can we convey this? Well, let's use the word being, but erase it, put an X through it. Sous rature. And this is a technique that Derrida sometimes plays with. What he's suggesting is you have the word writing. Right? Well, the word writing is irrevocably part of the whole history of metaphysics and so on. We can't turn it into a utopian word because we're not yet in this new world. We're still in the old world. We can't get out of it by thinking and or by writing. So, but we have to do something to this term. So, one of the alternatives to saying archi-écriture would be to say écriture with an X'd out, under erasure. Écriture crossed out in such a way that you know I'm not using it in its older sense anymore. I'm using it in this transcendental sense, which, however, remains negative in the sense that I can't substitute for this faulty language that we have to speak some new, brand new, newly forged utopian language which would no longer be metaphysical. I can't do that because we're not. That isn't any place. We have no access to such a world, such a language, and maybe never will. So the only way that we can deal with the faulty language and implications of the words we have to use now is by using them under erasure, using them but not using them, using them but at the same time saying, I'm sorry, I'm using this word, and remember that every time you use it, it's a metaphysical word, and so on and so forth. And essentially then, using it a little bit in the way that I suggested the Frankfurt School tended to use the word nature, that is, nature under erasure. There never was such a thing, but we have to use it, but don't let our use of it imply what it's not supposed to imply. Now, obviously, this is not a, it's a nice solution for Derrida in the sense that then it becomes a real form of non-phonetic writing, right? That is, you have your phonetic alphabet, but then the X is like, what is that? I mean, that has no phonetic component, so that's real writing if there are. And yet, in another sense, it's not writing, and it's a trick, and it's not a solution. And so all it can do is serve as a symbol of the operation of deconstruction. Deconstruction doesn't really destroy anything. It takes things apart, shows what's going on in them, and then puts them under erasure. But it doesn't criticize them in the older way. It doesn't substitute for them some new thing because it can't, and so forth. Okay, I think perhaps unless there's some questions or observations or whatever, I think we'll leave Derrida today. Let me just say one more thing, though, about this book. I think this is in many places, a very powerful book. The power in it comes from as much, maybe even more than from Derrida, comes from Rousseau. In attacking Rousseau, deconstructing, destroying, criticizing Rousseau, Derrida reinvents Rousseau. And I would suggest, if you want to feel the real excitement of this, then go back and reread, not necessarily the essay on the origin of language, which I think is probably hard to find anyway, but the second discourse. Because everything is there in the second discourse, and if one, as one should, if one recharges Derrida with the quotient and of Rousseau that this book is supposed to have, then all of a sudden history is present again. And I would say that under the guise of a critique of presence, of utopia and so on, Derrida reinvents the kind of immense and kind of hypnotic, fascinating power of Rousseau's whole notion of presence, and that's here too, and that's what gives this book its at least part of its energy. And deconstruction, I think, is very much a process which draws on the energies even of what it's canceling out or putting under erasure. So I would like next time as much to talk about Rousseau as about Derrida. And to show then and to use that as one of the ways back into the history which seems to be left out of the official framework of Derrida himself. Okay, so then tomorrow morning we'll talk about Conrad.